The War for Mansoul by John Bunyan, as told by Ethel Barrett. Copyright 1998, Christian Light Publications Incorporated, Harrisonburg, Virginia. Shaddai's forces repulsed. Trumpets were blown, and the king's army leapt into action. Banners waved, and from 40,000 men the battle cry went up, "Ye must be born again!" The war was on, indeed. The actual fighting started out in low key, like the muted rumbling of distant thunder, then rose and swelled and subsided, and rose and swelled again, taking enough surprise turns to boggle the imagination. There were minor skirmishes at first, with both sides hoping to keep it down to this scale and prevent escalation if possible. It was in one of these skirmishes that Will sallied forth, fell in upon the rear of Captain Boanger's men, and captured 3 prisoners. He delivered them eagerly to Diabolus, glad of a chance to reinstate himself, for he still felt rather a fool for the hesitant way he had conducted himself on the city wall. "Who are you?" said Diabolus, when they were brought before him. The question was a matter of form. He already knew. "Mr. Tradition, sire." "Mr. Human Wisdom, sire." "Mr. Man's Invention, sire." "You don't sound like the king's men," said Diabolus. "Are you proselytes?" "Well, hardly," said Mr. Tradition. "We came upon Shaddai's captains while they were on their way here, and offered our services," said Mr. Human Wisdom. "Actually," said Mr. Man's Invention, "we do not live so much by religion as by the fates of fortune. Whichever way the wind blows, you know." "Ah, yes," said Diabolus. "And if you are willing to entertain us—" "You are willing to serve me. Yes, I understand," said Diabolus. He was already scribbling a note. "I'm sending you to one of my captains. He will take care of you. You will be made at least sergeants, perhaps even armor-bearers." He handed Will the note. "Will you escort them and see that they get quartered and settled?" he said. Will took the note and departed in a bustle with his charges, with ruffling words and much heel-clicking. "Who'd you send them to?" said Beelzebub, after they had left. "Captain Anything, naturally," said Diabolus. "Naturally," said Beelzebub. A week later the explosion occurred. The king's men had managed to dismount the 2 guns on the tower over Eargate, the guns called High Mind and Heady. The townsmen answered with shout against shout, charge against charge. New officers were thrown into the front lines. Mr. Puff-Up, Sergeant Prejudice, Captain Anything, who had for his armor-bearer Mr. Man's Invention, and yes, Sergeant Tradition and Sergeant Human Wisdom. With battering rams, with slings, with guns, with swords, the battle raged, but Eargate could not be broken down. The casualties began to mount. One good shot blasted a hole in the roof of Lord Mayor Understanding's castle and let in some light. Lord Will was almost killed outright with a sling, but he recovered. Many of the aldermen were slain. Other guns were dismounted and laid flat in the dirt. But Eargate held fast. When the great battle was over and the smoke cleared, the awful truth was that the first round belonged to Mansoul. The king's captains retreated to their winter quarters, a safe distance away. It was all over but the shouting. But nobody in the town felt like shouting. Something had happened to Mansoul. Even though the townspeople were safe inside, they could not sleep. They tried to be merry again. "Look," they told themselves, "we can do anything we want to. There's no limit, no law, no censorship. There are no restrictions at all." But the things that they could do had somehow lost their appeal. Alarm flares kept going up from the camp of Shaddai's army. They could be seen from Mansoul all too well. The nights were the worst. Sometimes Captain Conviction would take all 10,000 of his men and run around the walls of the city all night, shouting the battle cry, "Ye must be born again!" These alarms from without had a wearying down effect on the townsfolk of Mansoul. And out of their weariness came whispers, "We cannot go on like this," and "Perhaps we should return to King Shaddai and end our troubles." And in fear, "But would he take us now?" But by some strange coincidence, these alarms had a stimulating effect on old Mr. Conscience. He could not be drugged any more, but began to roar with a voice of thunder that shook the whole town and set everyone a-trembling. There was no noise now so terrible to Mansell as the voice of conscience and the shoutings of the captains. Certain things began to grow scarce in Mansell, reaching the proportions of famine. Upon all her pleasant things there was a blast and burning instead of beauty. Wrinkles now, and some shows of the shadow of death were on the inhabitants. They would have gladly exchanged anything they had for peace of mind. Peace of mind! Shaddai's captains kept sending summons by "Take heed what you hear," Boanger's trumpeter, to add to Mansell's misery. The first time he treated them gently, then a little more roughly. The third time he dealt with them very roughly, telling them he did not know whether the captains were inclining to mercy or judgment. It was this third summons that precipitated the parley. A parley! The cry rang out, and the good news spread quickly all over town. Yes, they were going to talk peace. The officials of Mansell were even now drawing up the terms under which they would surrender. The day was set. The crowds gathered and waited eagerly as the trumpet sounded. The captains came up in their harness, with their 10,000s at their feet. And it was announced that the townsmen had heard and considered the summons, and would come to an agreement with them and with their King Shaddai upon certain terms that Diabolus had ordered them to propound. Then the conditions were read by Wilbywell. "These be our conditions of peace," he bellowed. "We will submit to King Shaddai upon the following conditions. 1. That our own officials still rule and govern Mansell. 2. That no man now serving under Diabolus be cast out. 3. That we may still enjoy certain rights and privileges granted us under our master, Diabolus. 4. That no new law or officer have power over us without our consent." Captain Boanders, who had stiffened at the first condition, stepped forward. His voice was low, but it carried to the farthest listener. "O inhabitants of Mansell, when I first heard your trumpet sound for a parley with us, I was glad. When you said you were willing to submit yourselves to our King and Lord, I was yet more joyous. But then, by your silly provisos and foolish quibbling, you laid the stumbling block of your iniquity before your own faces. My joy was turned to fear for you." His voice rose. "I perceive that old Ill-Paws had a hand in drawing up those proposals. They are not fit to be heard by anyone who even pretends to serve Shaddai. In the name of my king, I refuse and reject your conditions with the highest disdain." Mansell was shocked into silence. "But, oh, Mansell," Boanger's voice turned to pleading, "if you will but give yourself into the hands of our king and trust him to make the terms, his terms will be profitable to you. Trust yourself to Shaddai. He demands nothing less than unconditional surrender." "Unconditional surrender?" Old Unbelief leaped forward. "Consider what you are doing. Who would be so foolish as to take the staff out of his own hands and put it in the hands of someone who wants such complete submission?" He turned frantically to the Mansellians. "If you once yield, if you give yourselves up to another, you are no longer your own. To give yourselves up to an unlimited power is the greatest folly. Folly! Folly!" His voice seemed to ricochet along the walls and echo and re-echo endlessly, and the Mansellians stood there stunned and silent, listening. That did it. After the silence, they all began to talk at once. They were thrown into confusion beyond all hope of reaching an agreement. When the officials returned to the castle, Diabolus was waiting, and he was delighted. He slapped old Unbelief on the back as he went into the chamber of state. "My Lord Mayor," he said, "my faithful Unbelief, what a remarkable job you did. If we ever get through this mess, I shall one day make you my universal deputy. Yes, why not? How would you like that? I hear you even kept understanding and an old fool conscious from being at the parley. Oh, you clever, clever. Here, have a cigar. Imported brimstone. Take the whole box. My universal deputy some day, yes. Next to me you'll have all nations under your hand. Nor shall any of our vassals walk more at liberty than those that shall be content to walk in your fetters." Mayor Unbelief left the chamber of state, his head in the clouds with dreams of future power. Imagine, universal deputy! So puffed up was he that he did not see the mob coming toward him until they were almost upon him. He opened his mouth to speak, then stopped, stunned. They were headed by Lord Understanding and Mr. Conscience. Impossible, but it was so, and they were angry. He stopped, drew himself up to his full height, and prepared to quash their wrath with the bigness and the show of his countenance. But they would not be quashed. They came on running. He decided to run too. He turned and fled, they upon his heels, until he came to his house, where he slipped in through the front door, bolted it behind him, and decided that he could address them with more dignity from an upper window. In a moment he popped his head out. "Where'd you come from? Who let you out?" he bawled, and then he got hold of himself. Gentlemen, he asked, "what is the reason for this uproar?" Lord Understanding stepped forward. "You would not let Mr. Conscience and me be at the parley," he cried. "You propounded terms of peace that could not possibly be accepted without making King Shaddai a mere figurehead, and you charged Shaddai's captains with treachery when they offered mercy." "Treason, treason!" Unbelief shouted. "To your arms, O trusty friends of Diabolus!" "Call it treason if you like," said Understanding, "but those captains deserve better treatment at your hands." "I spoke for my prince," wailed Unbelief. "Stop the dramatics," old Mr. Conscience broke in, "and don't answer the mayor like that. He has spoken the truth. And don't be so impudent. You have caused enough grief. If you'd accept the conditions, we would not be in a state of war right now." "Watch it," cried Unbelief. "I'll report you to Diabolus, and you'll have to answer to your words. Meanwhile, we'll seek the good of the town without any help from you." "You and Diabolus are impostors," cried Understanding. "You seek the good of the town?" "Treason!" shouted Unbelief again, and he leaned so far out he nearly fell out of his window. His cries brought results. Lord Will-be-will and Mr. Prejudice and several aldermen and burgesses and even old Ill-Paws himself came running up to ask the reason of the hubbub. With that, everybody began to talk at once, and no one could be heard distinctly. Hold it, Unbelief bellowed. There was a sudden silence. "My lord," said Unbelief to Will-be-will. Now his voice could have been spread on a cracker. "There are a couple of peevish gentlemen here who have, as the fruit of their bad dispositions, I fear, gathered a mob against me and caused this tumult. It is not myself alone that I care for, but methinks that they are attempting to run the town into acts of rebellion against our prince. It's preposterous. Mutiny! Call it mutiny, then. We'll fight." And they did. First words, "Take them to prison." "Oh, no, you won't." "Unbelief, live forever." "The devil he will. We'll chop him down right now." "Down with censorship." "Up with Mr. Forgetgood." "Long live Mr. Conscience." "Shaddai's captains would ruin our economy." "Shaddai's captains offered us mercy." Then blows. Whoosh! Old Conscience was knocked down twice by Mr. Benumbing. But for a poor aim, Lord Understanding would have been slain with a musket. But it wasn't all one-sided. Whop! Mr. Mind beat the brains out of Mr. Rashhead. Old Mr. Prejudice was kicked, thrown in the dirt, and had his crown cracked to boot. Captain Anything wasn't popular on either side because he'd never been true to anyone. He got pushed back and forth from one side to the other. He got one of his legs broken, and some wished it had been his neck. Oh, what a fight! What a futile, useless fight! Lord Will-be-will was seen to smile when he saw Old Prejudice tumble in the dirt. When Captain Anything came halting up to him, he seemed to take but little notice. He really did not take one side more than the other. But Will-be-will was no match for Diabolus, nor was Mansoul. Fighting within, confusion was the old master's best weapon, and turning Mansoul's best efforts into shambles his genius. With all this awakening, it was a shameful page in their history that Mansoulians listened to him again. But after the dust settled, they did. Diabolus finally threw Conscience and Lord Understanding in prison, made another speech full of double talk on liberty, and reduced them all to simpering idiots again. Eargate remained closed. Blind, blind Mansoul. It could not stand up against Diabolus or resist his wiles, and so its bravest efforts went down in defeat. But far, far away, over the hills and plains, another army was marching to aid the 4 brave captains outside the city walls. An army headed by none other than Prince Emmanuel himself. An army that could not be resisted. No, Mansoul was no match for Diabolus. But Emmanuel was.